The fog clung to the hollows of West Virginia like a shroud, muting the world into shades of gray as the year 1901 dragged its weary feet toward winter. In the shadowed folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the trees whispered secrets older than the coal veins beneath them, lay the forgotten town of Eldridge Hollow. It was a place where folks kept their doors bolted after dusk, not just against the chill, but against the things that stirred in the underbrush, things that no lantern could chase away. Whispers traveled on the wind here, tales of men vanishing from logging camps or wayward travelers never seen again, their echoes swallowed by the endless woods. And at the heart of it all, perched on a rise where the forest met barren fields, stood the Pike farm, home to the two sisters who rarely ventured into town, their eyes sharp as rusted nails when they did. Elara and Maud Pike, they were called, though few dared speak their names aloud. Twins, or so the story went, bound by blood and something darker, their weathered faces etched with lines that spoke of burdens no woman should bear. The barn behind their clapboard house loomed larger than it should, its timbers warped and blackened, as if the structure itself recoiled from the secrets it held. Nights in Eldridge Hollow were alive with sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and sometimes, just on the edge of hearing, voices. Muffled pleas, guttural moans drifting from the direction of that barn, carried on the breeze like smoke from a dying fire. The townsfolk chalked it up to foxes or the wind playing tricks, but deep down, they knew better. They knew to stay away, to let the woods keep their mysteries. It started with Jacob Harlan, a young surveyor from Charleston, sent to map the untamed tracts for the railroad barons. He arrived on a crisp October evening, his horse lathered from the climb, unaware that his path would lead him straight into the maw of nightmare. The innkeeper, a grizzled man named Silas, eyed him warily over a mug of watery ale. "Best not wander far," Silas muttered, his voice low as if the walls might listen. "Them woods, they got ears. And hungers." Jacob laughed it off, attributing the warning to mountain folklore, but that night, as he lay in his narrow bed, the voices came to him. Faint at first, like murmurs from a dream, growing insistent, pulling at the threads of his curiosity until he could no longer ignore them. By dawn, he resolved to seek their source, stepping into the mist-shrouded path that wound toward the Pike farm, where the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood long dried. As Jacob approached, the barn's silhouette cut against the paling sky, its doors slightly ajar, exhaling a fetid warmth that made his skin crawl. He paused, heart thudding in his chest, the voices clearer now, desperate, overlapping, a chorus of despair hidden in the dark. What lay within those walls? What abomination had the sisters wrought in their isolation? The woods seemed to close in, branches like skeletal fingers urging him forward, into the unfolding horror that would shatter the fragile veil between the known world and the unspeakable truths buried beneath. The year 1901 lingered in the Appalachian Mountains like a fever dream, the air heavy with the promise of a hard winter that would bury the hollows under snow and silence. Nestled deep in the shadowed folds of West Virginia, where the ridges rose like the spine of some ancient beast, lay Eldridge Hollow, a speck of a town forgotten by maps and progress alike. The forest here was old, older than the scattered cabins and the crooked church steeple, its canopy so dense that daylight filtered through in pale, reluctant shafts. Pine and hemlock crowded the slopes, their roots twisting through soil rich with the rot of centuries, while laurel thickets choked the understory, turning every path into a labyrinth that seemed to shift when no one watched. Fog was a constant companion in Eldridge Hollow, rising from the creeks at dawn and clinging to the valleys until dusk, wrapping the world in a damp veil that muffled sound and blurred edges. On still evenings, it pooled in the low places like milk in a bowl, swallowing fence posts and stone walls until only the tops of the tallest trees remained visible, ghostly sentinels against the grey sky. Folks said the fog carried memories, or perhaps warnings, for it was in those shrouded hours that the disappearances grew noticeable. A logger heading home from the high camps might step into the mist and never emerge. A peddler with his wagon of notions could vanish between one ridge and the next. Travelers who asked too many questions at the crossroads store often failed to reach the next settlement down the trace. The town absorbed these losses the way the mountains absorbed rain, quietly, without protest, as if such things were the natural order. At night, the hollow came alive with its own uneasy chorus. Wind sighed through the branches, carrying the distant cry of a barred owl or the sharp bark of a fox. But beneath those familiar sounds lay something subtler, something that pricked the skin and quickened the pulse. Whispers, some called them. Others swore they heard low moans or fragmented words drifting on the breeze, too faint to decipher yet impossible to ignore. They seemed to rise from the woods themselves, from the dark heart where no trail led and no lantern dared linger. Mothers pulled their children closer when the voices stirred. Men checked the latches on their doors twice, then a third time for good measure. No one spoke of it openly, but every soul in Eldridge Hollow knew the direction from which those sounds came, toward the high clearing where the Pike farm stood alone, its barn a black silhouette against the stars, exhaling secrets into the night. Beyond the last bend in the rutted trace that served as the main road into Eldridge Hollow, the Pike farm sat like a scar on the hillside, its fields gone fallow and overgrown with briars that clawed at the sky. The house itself was a squat, unpainted thing, its windows narrow and watchful, curtains drawn even in daylight as if the sunlight offended whatever lived within. But it was the barn that drew the eye and held it against one's will, a hulking structure of blackened timber twice the size it needed to be for any honest farming, its roof sagging under the weight of years and secrets, the great doors barred with iron that had long since rusted to the color of old blood. Everyone in the hollow knew the sisters who dwelt there, though few could claim to have spoken with them more than a handful of times. Elara and Maud Pike had come to the farm as young women, inheriting it from a father whose name was rarely uttered and a mother who had vanished into the woods one autumn night never to return. They were mirrors of each other, tall and gaunt, with the same iron-grey hair twisted into severe knots and the same pale eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh to bone. When they did descend into town for salt or lamp oil, they moved as one, speaking little, their voices low and clipped like the snap of dry twigs. Children were hurried indoors at their approach, dogs slunk away with tails tucked. Folks tipped their hats out of habit more than courtesy, receiving only a curt nod in return before the sisters turned back toward their solitary domain. Rumors clung to the Pikes the way moss clung to the north side of the ridges. Some said their father had trafficked with things best left unnamed in the deep hollows, trading souls for bountiful harvests that never quite materialized. Others whispered that the sisters themselves were not wholly human, born too close together, sharing a single shadow between them. But mostly, people spoke of the barn, of lights flickering within long after decent folk were abed, of strange odors carried down on the night wind, sweet and rank at once, and of the way no animal would graze the pasture nearest its walls, not even the hardiest goats. Travelers were warned to skirt the farm widely, for those who lingered too near sometimes failed to reach their destinations, their names added quietly to the long list of the missing. Yet the sisters endured, untouched by law or gossip, their isolation a fortress stronger than stone. They tended a small garden that yielded unnaturally through the lean months, and once a year, on the shortest day, smoke rose thick from the barn's chimney, though no one had seen them haul wood enough for such a blaze. The people of Eldridge Hollow learned to live with the unease, the way one learns to live with an old wound that aches before rain. They crossed themselves when passing the lane that led upward, averted their eyes from the distant silhouette against the sky, and prayed that whatever hunger stirred behind those barred doors would remain sated with whatever it already claimed. The nights in Eldridge Hollow carried a weight all their own, a stillness so complete that every small sound seemed to echo twice, once in the ear and once in the soul. When the sun slipped behind the western ridges, the fog thickened into something almost solid, pooling in the yards and creeping up the porch steps like a living thing. Lanterns were lit early, their yellow glow barely pushing back the dark, and families gathered close around the hearth, speaking in murmurs as if louder voices might summon what waited beyond the window glass. It was on such a night, the third Jacob Harlan spent in the hollow, that the voices found him. He had retired early, claiming weariness from the day's surveying, though in truth the inn's thin walls and the restless creaking of the old building had kept sleep at bay. The room was small, the bed narrow, the single window frosted with October chill. He lay staring at the ceiling beams, counting knots in the pine to quiet his mind, when the first murmur reached him. At first he thought it wind threading through the eaves, a low susurrus like dry leaves skittering across stone. But the sound shaped itself, gaining texture, rising and falling in a rhythm too deliberate for nature. He sat up, heart quickening, and pressed his ear to the wall. Nothing there but the faint snoring of Silas in the next room. The window, then. He crossed the cold floorboards in his stockings and pushed the sash upward, letting in a rush of damp air that smelled of leaf mold and distant wood smoke. The fog hung thick outside, turning the world into a formless grey sea, but the voices came clearer now, threadbare fragments carried across the valley. They were human, unmistakably so, though stripped of strength and hope. A low moan here, a choked syllable there, overlapping in a mournful cadence that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Some sounded like pleas, others like names half-remembered, all of them laced with a despair so profound it made the skin prickle and the breath catch. Jacob leaned farther out, straining to place the direction. The sounds drifted from the northeast, from the high ground where the forest pressed closest to the Pike farm. They ebbed and swelled with the breeze, now faint as a sigh, now sharp enough to distinguish the rattle of metalled chains, perhaps, or iron links shifting against wood. He told himself it was imagination, that mountain nights played tricks on city ears, yet the voices persisted, weaving through the fog like threads of smoke, insistent, pulling at something deep within him. They spoke no coherent words he could grasp, only tones, agony, exhaustion, a terrible patience worn thin by years. Hour after hour they continued, fading only when the first pale hint of dawn bled across the sky, leaving Jacob trembling beneath his blankets, the echoes lingering behind his eyes long after silence returned. By the fourth day, Jacob Harlan had ventured into the heart of Eldridge Hollow, his surveyor's chain and notebook serving as flimsy excuses to linger among the weathered storefronts and clustered cabins. The townsfolk regarded him with the wary politeness reserved for outsiders, polite enough to sell him coffee or tobacco, wary enough to keep their distances. He asked questions about the terrain, the ridges, the old trails, but always his conversation drifted toward the missing men, the strange silences that fell over certain topics, and, inevitably, toward the Pike Sisters and their farm. The responses came in fragments, delivered with downcast eyes or quick glances over shoulders. Old Widow Greer, who kept the dry goods store, muttered that some folks were best left alone, her gnarled fingers tightening around the coins he offered for a tin of peaches. The blacksmith, a broad man named Caleb whose arms were scarred from sparks and hard living, paused mid-stroke at his anvil to warn that curiosity had claimed more lives in these mountains than fever or flood. When Jacob pressed about the voices heard on certain nights, Caleb only spat into the forge and resumed his hammering, the clang of iron on iron drowning further words. At the Crossroads Saloon, where loggers gathered after their shifts, the talk grew looser with each tin cup of corn liquor. One man, his face half-shadowed by a slouch hat, spoke of a cousin who had taken work up near the Pike Place years back and simply never come down the mountain again. Another claimed to have seen tracks leading toward the barn, bare human feet, dragging, as though something heavy had been pulled through the mud. But when Jacob leaned closer, asking for names or dates, the circle tightened, voices dropped to whispers, and the stories dissolved into vague warnings about mountain superstitions and the folly of city men who thought every riddle needed solving. A boy no older than 12, sent to fetch water from the spring, paused long enough to hiss that the sisters kept something in that barn that wasn't livestock, something that cried out when the moon was thin. His mother appeared moments later, yanking him away by the ear, apologizing with tight lips and promising the child would be whipped for spreading tales. Yet even she, in her hurried retreat, cast a fearful glance toward the high ridge where the farm crouched against the tree line. Each encounter left Jacob with scraps of truth wrapped in evasion, warnings delivered not as threats but as reluctant kindness, as if the townsfolk believed ignorance might yet save him where knowledge had failed others. They spoke of the barn only in sidelong references, the big building, the place up the hollow, that old structure, never naming it directly, as though giving it voice might summon its attention. And always, beneath the caution, lay the same unspoken plea, leave it be, stranger, before the woods decide you belong to them. Jacob Harlan's resolve hardened with each evasive answer, until curiosity overpowered caution and drove him to the dusty shelves of the county clerk's office in the nearest rail town, a day's hard ride from Eldridge Hollow. The building smelled of mildew and coal smoke, its records stacked in teetering piles that no one had disturbed in decades. With the clerk's grudging permission, Jacob pored over yellowed ledgers, land deeds, and forgotten court filings, tracing the Pike name backward through the years like a man following a blood trail. The farm had belonged to the family since the 1830s, granted to an ancestor who had fought under Jackson and chosen isolation over the crowded valleys below. But it was the entries from the 1860s and 70s that chilled him most. A journal bound in cracked leather, misfiled among tax receipts, had once belonged to the sisters' grandfather, Amos Pike. The handwriting grew shakier with each season, the ink fading to brown, yet the words remained legible enough to curdle the blood. Amos wrote of a bargain struck during a winter so bitter that livestock froze standing in their stalls and the creeks locked solid for months. With his wife great with child and starvation gnawing at the door, he had ventured deeper into the mountains than any sane man would go, to a place the Cherokee had abandoned long before, where the trees grew twisted and the ground refused certain seeds. There, beneath a stone outcrop marked with symbols no preacher could name, he offered what little he had left, his faith, his future, perhaps more, for the promise of enduring blood. The journal did not spell out the terms, only hinted at them in frantic scrawl: payment in flesh, renewal through issue, a lineage that must never thin. Crops flourished the following spring, unnaturally lush, and his wife bore healthy twins though she had been frail as paper. But the price, Amos confessed in pages stained with tears or sweat, came due in slow increments, first a stillbirth, then a child that lived but never spoke, then wanderers drawn off the trace as if by unseen hands. Later records showed the sisters' father, Elias, inheriting the same shadowed prosperity and the same creeping dread. He married late, to a woman from outside the hollow whose name appeared only once before she, too, vanished into the woods one autumn, leaving infant daughters behind. Elias's own diary, thinner and more guarded, spoke of duties he could not escape, of locking away temptations, of keeping the barn prepared. Phrases repeated like a litany: blood calls to blood, the line must hold, what is taken must be replaced. The final entry, dated just months before his sudden death, described dreams of chains and voices rising from beneath the floorboards, pleading for release that could never be granted. Jacob closed the volumes with trembling fingers, the weight of inherited madness settling over him like grave dust. The documents painted no mere tale of eccentricity but a deliberate, generational descent into something profane, a desperate pact renewed with each passing decade in the only currency the mountains seemed to accept. The barn was not an afterthought, it was the heart of the obligation, the repository where the debt was paid in living breath and stolen seed. The moon had thinned to a ragged sliver by the time Jacob Harlan slipped from the inn, his boots sinking into the mud of the trace as he followed a deer path that skirted the sleeping town. The air was sharp with frost, each breath pluming white before him, and the forest closed in quickly, branches knitting overhead until only faint silver threads of light pierced the canopy. He carried no lantern, its glow would betray him too soon, so he moved by feel and memory, one hand trailing along trunks slick with moss, the other clutching the small revolver he had bought in Charleston and never expected to need. The climb grew steeper, the ground rising in uneven shelves that forced him to scramble over roots and shale. Somewhere below, a night bird called once and fell silent, as though the woods themselves held their breath. The voices had haunted him all day, faint echoes behind every conversation, every clatter of cutlery at supper, until restraint snapped like an overwound spring. He told himself he sought only a glimpse, proof enough to summon authorities or silence his own doubts, but deeper down he knew the pull was older than reason, the same current that had drawn others before him and never let them go. At last the trees thinned, revealing the high clearing where the Pike farm crouched against the ridge. The house was dark, its chimney cold, but the barn loomed ahead, larger than memory allowed, its silhouette swallowing starlight. Jacob crouched behind a stand of laurel, heart hammering against his ribs, and studied the structure. The timbers were blackened by age and weather, seams gaping like wounds, and the roofline sagged in the middle as though something immense pressed from within. A single high window, unglazed and barred with iron, stared down like an empty eye socket. Then he heard it, the faint metallic clink that had threaded through the night voices, clearer now, unmistakable. Chains. Not the heavy links of a trace chain or logging gear, but lighter, thinner, shifting with a rhythm too deliberate for wind. They came from inside the barn, muffled by thick walls yet persistent, accompanied by the occasional scrape of metal on wood and a low, collective murmur that rose and fell like breathing. Jacob edged closer, keeping to the shadows of overgrown orchard trees, until he could smell the place, damp hay gone sour, animal musk, and beneath it something coppery and warm that turned his stomach. The great doors stood slightly ajar, a finger's breadth of blackness exhaling into the night. From that gap issued the faint warmth he had detected earlier, fetid and close, carrying with it the chain's soft rattle and the voices, closer now, layered, some hoarse with disuse, others reduced to wet clicks in the throat. He pressed himself against the rough siding, splinters pricking through his coat, and peered through the crack, eyes straining against the deeper dark within. Shapes moved in the gloom, slow, ponderous shifts of shadow, and the air seemed to thicken around him, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes turned in his direction. The crack between the barn doors was narrow, yet it yawned wide enough for Jacob to force one eye against it, the rough wood scraping his cheek as he leaned in. At first the darkness inside seemed absolute, a solid mass that swallowed the faint starlight and gave nothing back. Then his vision adjusted, picking out dim shapes in the gloom, stalls long emptied of livestock, hay matted and black with age, cobwebs draping the rafters like funeral lace. The air that seeped through the gap was thick, warm in a way that felt wrong against the frost outside, carrying a stench of unwashed bodies, waist-long accumulated, and something sweeter, cloying, like milk gone bad. He shifted for a better angle, breath held shallow, and the interior resolved into nightmare clarity. Along both walls, where cattle once stood, iron rings had been driven deep into the beams at intervals. From each ring hung a length of chain, rusted yet strong, leading downward to collars or manacles that gleamed dully where skin had worn them bright. The men, 37 of them, though Jacob could not count in that first frozen moment, were fastened there like beasts awaiting slaughter, some seated on filthy straw, others slumped against posts, their bodies wasted to bone and sinew beneath ragged remnants of clothing. Beards tangled and matted, hair grown wild over eyes that stared at nothing or flickered toward the door with the dull glint of trapped animals. Few stood upright. Most had long since lost the strength, their legs bowed or swollen, ankles raw where iron bit flesh. The chains allowed scant movement, enough to reach a shared bucket of water or the trough that held whatever meager slop sustained them, never enough to reach one another or the doors. They breathed in shallow unison, a wet, rattling chorus that rose and fell with the faint clatter of links whenever one shifted. Some rocked slowly, back and forth, mouths working soundlessly. Others muttered fragments too broken to form words, names perhaps, or pleas that had lost all hope of answer. In the center of the floor, a cleared space showed signs of recent use, scuffed earth, darker stains that caught what little light leaked in, and a low bench fashioned from rough planks, its surface worn smooth in the middle as though by repeated weight. Above it, hooks dangled from a crossbeam, empty now but swaying gently, and Jacob's mind recoiled from the purpose they implied. The men nearest the doors seemed newer arrivals, their frames less shrunken, bruises fresh along ribs and thighs, eyes still holding sparks of defiance or terror. Those deeper in the shadows had surrendered long ago, reduced to vessels that breathed and waited, their humanity leached away drop by drop into the thirsty boards beneath them. A low groan rippled through the barn, several voices joining in a wordless lament that vibrated in Jacob's chest. One man, closer than the rest, lifted his head with painful slowness, hollow gaze fixing on the sliver of night visible through the crack. For an instant Jacob feared he had been seen, but the prisoner's lips only parted, exhaling a sigh that carried no strength, before his chin sank again to his chest. The chains settled with a soft, collective chime, and the warm darkness pressed closer, as though the barn itself resented the intrusion of outside air. The scene before Jacob fractured, the barn's present horror bleeding into visions that were not his own, as though the collective anguish of the chained men had pried open a door in his mind. Images came unbidden, sharp and vivid, layering over the gloom like lantern slides projected on smoke. He saw the sisters as young women, scarcely past girlhood, standing hand in hand before a freshly dug grave on the windswept ridge. Their father's coffin, rough-hewn pine, lowered by neighbors who fled the farm before the earth was fully tamped. Elara and Maud, identical in their black dresses and white grief, listening to the wind carry away the preacher's words while something older whispered promises in their ears. The visions shifted. Winter again, but decades earlier, the barn newly raised, its timbers still bleeding sap. Amos Pike on his knees in the loft, candle guttering beside an open Bible whose pages he no longer read. His wife's body lay cooling in the house, the latest child born dead and blue, the ground outside too iron-hard for burial. Hunger gnawed the family like a living thing, and Amos bargained in the dark, voice cracking as he offered devotion, land, anything, for the line to continue. The answer came not in words but in warmth that flooded the barn, in crops that pushed through frozen soil come spring, in twin daughters born healthy to a woman who should have died in childbed. But the warmth demanded return, slow interest compounded in flesh. Years collapsed. Elias Pike, the sisters' father, older now, dragging a struggling man through the doors at dusk, a drummer peddling patent medicines, lured by offers of shelter. The bench in the center, the hooks lowered, the sisters watching from the shadows with eyes too calm for their age. Elias's hands shook as he fastened the first collar, reciting fragments of his own father's warnings, but the farm flourished, the family endured, and the debt grew heavier with each new arrival. The sisters learned early, taught by necessity and something that spoke in their blood. When Elias finally hanged himself from the hayloft beam, unable to bear another season's accounting, the duty passed seamless to his daughters. Now the visions focused on Alara and Maud as they were middle-aged, movements precise and unhurried, tending their captives with the detached care of farmers fattening stock. They brought buckets of mash and water, changed straw when the stench grew too thick, selected which man would be led to the bench when the time came. Not for pleasure, the images made clear, but for continuance, a cold, mechanical ritual to quicken wombs that refused natural issue. Children born of such unions vanished young, taken by fever or accident or simply gone one morning, claimed as payment renewed. The sisters' faces in the visions released Jacob as abruptly as they had seized him, dumping him back into the frozen night with the barn's fetid warmth still clinging to his face. His legs nearly buckled, the revolver heavy and useless in his coat pocket, but something deeper than fear propelled him forward. He edged along the wall until his fingers found the smaller side door, its latch corroded but unbarred, yielding with a faint creak that seemed thunderous in the hush. Inside, the darkness was thicker, alive with the labored breathing of the prisoners and the constant soft chime of chains. He moved between the rows like a ghost, boots silent on the packed earth, eyes adjusting to pick out the nearest man, a logger by the remnants of his plaid shirt, beard streaked with grey, wrists raw and bleeding where iron had worn through skin. The captive's head lifted at Jacob's approach, eyes reflecting what little light seeped through chinks in the walls, wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Jacob knelt, fingers fumbling at the collar's crude lock, whispering assurances he barely believed himself. The man tried to speak, throat working soundlessly at first, then producing a rasp like dry leaves. "Key, on the beam, hurry." Jacob rose, scanning the gloom until he spotted the heavy ring of keys hanging from a nail high on the central post, just out of reach of any chained arm. He stretched, coat brushing straw, and snagged them down, the metal cold and sticky. Returning, he tried key after key, hands shaking, while the prisoner watched with agonizing patience. At last one turned, the lock clicking open, the collar falling away with a dull thud. The man sagged forward, rubbing his neck, tears cutting clean trails through the grime on his cheeks. Emboldened, Jacob moved to the next, then the next, freeing 3 in quick succession, motioning them toward the side door where moonlight waited like a promise. They supported one another, legs cramped from disuse, chains trailing until Jacob paused to unlock ankles as well. Whispers spread along the rows now, a ripple of awareness, heads turning, hands reaching weakly as hope kindled in eyes long dead to it. The fourth man, a younger fellow, perhaps a traveler like Jacob himself, gained his feet with surprising strength, seizing Jacob's arm in a grip fierce with gratitude. But freedom's first taste proved reckless. The young man lurched toward the main doors, intent on flinging them wide for the others, his bare feet slapping the earth. Jacob hissed a warning, too late. The heavy bar lifted with a scrape, the doors swinging outward on protesting hinges, spilling silver light across the interior. For one breathless moment the barn lay exposed, 37 gaunt figures stirring in their bonds, chains clattering in a sudden chorus. Then came the answer from the house, a sharp cry, feminine yet edged with iron, followed by the slam of a door and hurried footsteps on frozen ground. Lantern light bobbed across the yard, 2 figures emerging, tall and purposeful, shotguns cradled in their arms. The sisters had heard. The night exploded into motion, the freed men scattering toward shadows, Jacob pulling the logger toward the tree line as the first shotgun roar split the air, buckshot tearing splinters from the barn wall inches from where they had stood. The night fractured into chaos as shotgun blasts echoed across the clearing, buckshot shredding bark and laurel leaves where fleeing shadows darted. Jacob hauled the gray-bearded logger deeper into the trees, branches whipping their faces, the man's bare feet slipping on frost-slick stones as he gasped for air long denied. Behind them, the young escapee who had flung open the doors staggered and fell, a dark bloom spreading across his back, his cry cut short by the wet thud of impact. The sisters advanced without haste, lanterns swinging in steady arcs, their silhouettes tall and implacable against the barn's gaping maw where chained figures writhed in renewed frenzy, voices rising in a ragged, desperate swell. Ilara, or Maud, Jacob could no longer tell them apart, paused to reload, movements calm as churning butter, while the other swept the light across the tree line, picking out movement with unnerving precision. Another roar split the dark, closer now, scattering needles from the pines overhead. Jacob pushed onward, downward along a ravine he hoped would lead to the trace, the logger stumbling beside him, coughing blood-flecked spittle into the cold. The woods, once silent accomplices, now seemed alive with malice, roots snaring ankles, briars tearing flesh as though the mountain itself sought to drag them back to the barn. Yet the voices pursued most relentlessly, no longer muffled by timber walls but carried on the wind from the open doors, amplified into a chorus that clawed at the mind. They spoke now, or seemed to, fragments knitting into coherence born of shared torment across years. Names long forgotten surfaced, wives, children, hometowns abandoned interwoven with older words, syllables in a tongue that predated the hollow, rising from beneath the barn floor where something ancient stirred at the disturbance. The pact's terms laid bare in overlapping whispers, blood for blood, seed for continuance, the line unbroken lest the land reclaim all. One voice, deeper than the rest, threaded through the rest like a root through stone, recounting the bargain's origin in Amos Pike's starving winter, the price exacted in generations of stolen lives, the hunger that grew rather than sated with each offering. Another, thinner, wailed of children born and taken, pale things that never drew full breath, claimed before baptism to balance the ledger. The chorus swelled as the sisters' lanterns bobbed closer, their footsteps measured on the frozen ground, shotguns primed for the next volley. Jacob's lungs burned, vision tunneling as he crested a rise and saw distant lights of Eldridge Hollow below, too far for salvation tonight. The voices intensified, burrowing into thought, promising revelation if he would only turn back, confront the heart of the darkness, complete the accounting that had begun with his arrival. Some pleaded for mercy, others for vengeance, but beneath them all thrummed the original compact, patient as bedrock, waiting for the final payment that would either end the nightmare or bind the hollow forever in its embrace. The sister's call cut through, calm, almost maternal, naming him by name though he had never spoken it aloud, beckoning him home to the barn where the chains hung ready and the voices would at last fall silent.